listen to this podcast, or I'll gut you.
Okay, horror hounds, I want to invite to the podcast S.A. Bradley, author of this awesome new book called Screaming for Pleasure, as well as host of the HELLBENT for Horror Podcast, which is a really good podcast I got to listen to, by the way. How are you doing today, man?
Thank you so much for the kind introduction. I'm doing all right. I'm intrigued. I can't wait to see what we talk about. I did listen to the Candyman episode, and
Okay.
I liked where you went. I have one thing that I think needs to be said
Sure.
about what we have in the way of controversy around horror movies and people talking about being woke or not woke enough. People are finally reading film again. They're actually looking at what they're looking at.
That's
You
true.
need to at least look to be upset and whine and snivel and empty your diapers, whatever it is that these folks tend to have happen with them. They're at least reading. They know why they're offended. They're looking for it. It's no longer token characters written by someone who doesn't have any perspective that is putting people through these movies. They now know what it feels like to be looked at and seen. And that's kind of important because we've had this. I think that's what a lot of Candyman is about, is the idea of who's writing the story. This is all fable. When you get to the shadow figures, shadow puppets, that's right there telling you you're listening to a fable. Now, you can't tell who anybody is. There's no detail to them. They're just flipped on up there like shadows. And I think it's brilliant because of that.
So one of the things that I really loved about your book, and it's something that resonated with me, and I'm pretty sure it would make sense if you listen to that podcast. I've always loved horror and the power of allegory in horror, how we can take our social anxieties, which you discuss, things that are a little bit uncomfortable, things that would become preachy in a message movie. You insert them into the horror genre, and you're able to tell a story in a way that resonates a lot more widely. So I really appreciate you tackling that aspect of horror. I think that's one of the best and the richest things that the horror genre is capable of doing.
Well, thank you for that kindness. I call horror the most beautiful genre that there is because it's tailor-made for allegory and metaphor and parable. And it's kind of like Frank's hot sauce. You can put it on anything and it just builds it up. It doesn't take away. And I think that it really does allow us to speak to things that we don't even know we need to talk about. I like what the late Toby Hooper said after the millionth time he was asked about Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Everybody wants to say that movie just kind of happened, like it fell out of the camera. Couldn't possibly be made by this guy. And he would say, sometimes it takes 20 years for you to figure out what your movie was about. And that means that it's working on a subconscious level. Doesn't mean you're stupid. Art is not accounting. Everybody wants to have this thing of like, well, he didn't think of that. Romero wasn't thinking about a character that was black when it just happened to be a character. That makes it even more brilliant. They did not change any of the dialogue. He did not try to jazz it up in any way. He just let it happen. At that time period, that was revolutionary. And context is sometimes a thing that is missing. And I think that's what horror allows us to see, the context of whatever's happening for us now. Some movies change in their allegory because the world changes. And I think it's still like a great fable, like a great parable. It has all sorts of strong meaning because of that.
Well, for me, your book wasn't just fun and informative for a fan. It's also a fascinating study of horror for filmmakers and just storytellers in general. And the way you describe your personal experiences really made me want to try harder to construct scenes that make people feel like that. I really like the way you described your experiences.
That's awesome, because I do all this because I'm super selfish, right? I want really good horror movies. I like diversity. I want all the diversity because there are horror movies that are hidden out there that I may never see if we don't have people telling those perspectives. It's just a focal shift, right? Mm-hmm. It's not, you need a brand new second. They can't talk about that because we have postmen and they can't talk about postmen. No, of course they can't. It's just, how are you looking at all these different things? And I think that's fascinating. I found myself caught flat-footed and recognizing that I needed to change some shit up because my perceptions have been around for a long time. And if I'm only getting, the reinforcement of something that's already not quite true because it's been written by somebody who has nothing to do with the situation of the social strata, it's about time to change that, right? I need to be open to it at least.
I agree. So would you agree with me about this? Mike and I both really agree, are really feel this way, that right now I think is the most exciting time in the history of genre to be a fan. I feel like there are more avenues of storytelling that are starting to wake up. The diversity is bringing whole new voices and new perspectives to the genre. And you touch on that on your chapter on women directors and female directors and how it changed the perspective. Would you agree that this is the most exciting time to get into the horror genre?
I think it's the most exciting time that I've lived in.
Okay.
I can't say about like the silent films, because I think the silent films are super revolutionary because they didn't have to worry about sound. They could do anything. And so you had some really transgressive movies that were made in the silent era. And there were some super beautiful. But I think for genre now, it's not because of anything, I think, really profound. I think it's the same thing that happens all the time. There is a glut, right? There is a need for product. All these things have opened up. Everybody has a plus channel now, right? We got away from cable with streaming because we didn't want to have plus channels. Now streaming has plus channels. So there are all these things. And if you look at early Prime, Amazon Prime and Netflix, they put on movies that I know the people who made them. They're micro budget horror films, and they put them on there because they needed product. And horror films have always been there when the need is there. And I think that's happened multiple times in different things: comic books, punk rock, cable TV, horror hosts, all that stuff. The artistic side fills in the void for the businessmen who have this open time frame or open space that they're not able to sell. And until they figure out what they've got, it's fantastic for the artists. Once Amazon made Amazon Studios, they kicked out all those friends of mine and said their movies weren't worth having on. So a level of income was taken. But because of this, it's kind of like before in the 80s, that was the greatest time. It's always changing. There was the greatest time because before that, you didn't have home video or cable. So you could only watch a movie once. And I think about how these film scholars must have sat in a movie theater again and again and again to be able to write incredible critical essays of films before there were places that they could watch it and pause it, rewind it, and take a look. That's a form cut. Look how that changed. I can't believe that he used that character 3 times in the same film. Whatever it might be, they had to sit there and do that. They had to seriously pay attention. But then in the 80s, I was able to watch movies that would have never existed if it was only for theaters, although you had drive-ins. And then when drive-ins dried up, there was this empty space, this void for exploitation and horror films. So I think now, because we have all this streaming, we're getting to see what happened in the 80s. Like all of a sudden, I was able to see foreign horror films. Foreign horror films would have never come to my hometown, a coal mine town in Pennsylvania. We're not going to see The Grudge, Ju-On. We're not going to see any of those films. So I got to see them because one video store decided to be a little bit more adventurous and say, well, people are buying this. Maybe if I don't even know what that thing is, Coffin Joe, I don't know what that is. And then they bring that in. I'm like, what? So, that was a time when it was so great. And I think we also have it now where we have so many different streaming things. We are seeing straight up Latin films. We're seeing Asian films. We're seeing Black films. We're seeing LGBTQ films right up front in my queue. Not I have to go get a special coupon pass to be able to find this stream. It's on the stream, but it's also next to movies that are like what were they called, the Left Behind series, the Christian horror movies. They're living in the same place, up in the cloud. They have representation too, but it's no longer hidden, right? The horror films that I'm looking for, you don't have to be the nerd that I was to have to find Asian horror films, right? You can find them. They can find you. And then you can watch them and go, wow. And you can find out how many movies, talk about no representation. There have been magnificent Mexican films, Brazilian films that have been made of high quality. And until Guillermo del Toro breaks through the wall, those movies are not seen on this side. So we don't even know how good the movies can be. And now we're starting to find those. The Italian horror films of the 70s had their own look and feel. So I think what's great is none of that's been left behind. You have so many different venues. You can go back to the theater if you so wish. So there is still Hollywood able to make these things. And horror is leading the pack because they're super easy to make. And most of them are independent films that didn't go under any unions. So they actually still worked, taking life and limb into hand to make their horror films. Or they've been sitting in the shelf for years, never given a chance because the new, whatever his name, Tom Cruise movie took that slot and took 8 slots in the movie theater. Now they don't have Tom Cruise is staying home with a nice mask, eating pickles or whatever the fuck he does. And so he's sitting there doing that. And there's an empty hole. So all of a sudden, the horror movies that have been sitting on shelves are coming out. And guess what? They're making money, as horror always does. Horror has always been the forefront of, if you look at any box office for the year, count up all the horror movies. Yeah, there's never been a Marvel universe movie of horror that has made that kind of money, except for Joker, $1 billion. That's pretty amazing. Yeah. But other than that, it's nickel dime. 400 horror movies in 1 year makes $1 billion, right?
Yeah, that's true.
So you talk about your first experience with horror as a kid, as your first kiss. And yours was Don't Look Now. So can you talk a little bit about what scared you about Don't Look Now and what intrigued you? And are those two the same things?
That's a great question. I think it's, like I said, context. Context is everything. And I think we're finally moving away from or statements, my way or the highway. I think we're going to and statements. So it can be that it both terrified me and intrigued me. What I think did it for me with Don't Look Now, and anybody who hasn't seen this movie, it's from like 1973, 1974. And it's an art horror film, but I just call it a horror film. I think all the extra words are just kind of like, so you can figure out which drug you need to take for your depression or whatever. But the thing is that it's a horror film, and it was the first non-linear horror film I ever saw. It was the first film that took imagery and made it very strong and unusual. So because of the context that I saw horror films, I was a scaredy cat as a kid. And I got nightmares all the time. So my dad literally had to say, you can't watch this, you can watch this. So I saw a lot of giant ants and giant tarantulas with that very flat Hollywood lighting or independent film lighting where they have like 210Ks and they just shoot it on the set. So everything is white, right? And so I'm used to that. Cameras on sticks. They're not moving. The characters move. There might be movement back and forth. So little do I know. And I think this is something that we lose as adults for a while until we start being fascinated with film again. I think as a child, we're affected by motion, color, speed, sound, much more than we are as adults. And I think that we catch stuff that adults don't see, or they just go, oh, it's a camera shake. They might get it subconsciously, but I think we feel changes. So I'm watching this movie, Don't Look Now, which doesn't have fanfare music in the beginning. It just starts, boom, in a bucolic English countryside field. And there's a pond and there's a big mansion. And the family that lives there, we meet them without having, hello, son, hello, daughter, hello, husband, hello, wife. It's just the story starts. And I still get it, that the 2 kids outside are the kids, and the 2 people that are inside of the house, not watching the children, are the parents. And he's a photographer for architecture, and he has all these slides everywhere, and the wife is talking, and we keep cutting back and forth between the parents that are in this nice warm house, and we're seeing all these shots of like food and stuff, so we're supposed to feel very comfortable, but I'm starting to feel uneasy because I'm remembering that there's kids outside. And what do we see? But we see the camera shaky. The first time that we spend any time with the kids, it's a handheld shot of the girl walking through a wet field. The trees are around her. She's carrying a doll and she's pulling the string, and it's saying some weird stuff from World War II, whatever dolls were like in England at that time. And she's wearing this red raincoat and everything. So it's foggy and misty. And I'm just suddenly a little bit nervous. And they're shooting into the light, into the sun. So there are sun spots that are showing up on the lens. I don't know what that is, but it's all hitting me as this is not my normal way of looking at a horror film where everything is straight. Everything looks a certain way. It's all bright. The characters move. They're all well dressed and they stand straight and they don't mumble. And I'm watching this movie and I'm not quite getting what the kids are doing. And I'm starting to get really uneasy. And it starts doing things like shooting the shot upside down. I'm watching this girl running across the field upside down. I'm like, what is this? And it pulls back a little bit and we're looking at the reflection of her in the water. And then we see the ball and we just see her reaching over for it. And I feel the dread. We don't see what happens at all. And what's scary about this is that there's no music. None of the things that are usually the cues that I look for as a child watching horror movies. Nothing that's telling me anything scary is going to happen. And then Dad spills water on one of his slides. He's like, oh, shit. So he starts dabbing it off. And I don't understand chemistry or anything like that as a kid. I just see it, this slide has been made wet. And we look at the slide in the film, and there's a little red hooded figure in a church at the first pew. And there's a huge cathedral glass window and beautiful stained glass. And all of a sudden the music hits for the first time. We hear this brah noise and people like singing in reverse. And the film is degrading. And what we see is this big red blob start coming right out of the stained glass. And it's like this finger, this misty curling finger that's coming around the entire pew. And in my head, that's the devil. I'm a child. I'm looking at this. All of a sudden there's evil in this holy picture, right? And so I'm nervous and I don't know that he's cross-cutting and he's giving foreshadowing, none of that. I'm feeling it like bam, bam, bam. And the next thing, the father just stands up straight, nothing said, nobody says a word, and he just runs out of the house. And we already know that child that was leaning over has fallen into the water. I know it in my heart, even though I haven't seen a thing. And the next thing we see is the little girl going under the water and her red raincoat is fading away in the dark of the pond. And then Dad is running and the son is crying and screaming, Dad, Dad, Dad. It all feels very real. It feels like when my sister got hurt and my dad ran across the park and I'm like yelling, Dad, Dad, Dad. It all feels that real. It doesn't feel like a guy putting a gun up at an ant and shooting at it. And I'm horrified. And then he pulls her up and he's screaming in slow motion. His hair is matted over him. You know she's dead. And it is one of those things that is such a gripping moment. It's shot so idiosyncratically. It's done in so many weird styles that it completely bangs my head against the wall. And even to this day, Donald Sutherland can't watch that scene. He's the actor who's in that as the father. He can't watch it because it hits too close to home. And so that scared me. But it also tantalized me. It's like, what just happened? It's kind of like if you're walking around a fence and all of a sudden a dog goes, rah, 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 rah. You run, and then you look back and go, what the fuck? And you look back at the dog and you take note of it, and you may walk that way again, and you may walk around that fence so you don't get barked at, but maybe you do. And you're like, damn it, I'm going to get that dog to not bark at me next time. And so there is a fascination to the ugliness. I call it horrible beautiful, something that can look so disturbing that it's no longer pleasurable. It's no longer unpleasurable. It's a sense of awe. You're kind of helpless to stare forward. And I think that's the highest form that horror can reach. And so I didn't understand any of this at 10, but I got it all at an emotional level. And I spent years trying to figure out why I felt that way. So when I started reading about film, I'm like, there it is. That's the reason right there. I get it now. So does that mean that, I'm reading in? No, I felt it emotionally. And to me, that's what horror is all about. It doesn't need to be intellectual, but I love when it is. It's there. Its purpose is to get past the logic and go right to the art of the heart, right to the art of the stomach. It gets to that vitriolic spot, that emotion that I can't name. Why are you in a bad mood? I don't know. I just am. I got to watch a car wreck movie. Whatever it is, we get those things. We don't know why we feel that way. We just do. And horror, like music, has this way of being able to cut past the mind, which might be the problem at the time. You may be overthinking whatever the problem is, or you want to refuse whatever the answer is. And instead, this allows you to go right to that area in you where it doesn't matter. Like when I go to a punk or metal concert, I don't sit there thinking about, their whatever the lyrics are. I want to sweat.
Mm-hmm.
I'm releasing something there. I'm releasing something with my people.
So one of the interesting things, and by the way, that anecdote was really vivid. I always liked Don't Look Now, but it
Yes.
made me want to go and look at it through your point of view, look at it with fresh eyes. But I think that's that's the power of cinema, just to be the ability to use images, cross-cutting to induce a certain kind of feeling. I wanted to share with you something interesting. I had a different experience than most horror fans do. When I was a kid, I was a very strange little kid that was drawn to horror, and it didn't scare me for some reason. I thought it was fascinating, and my family never understood how I could sit there and watch these movies and not have an effect. This was like at 4 or 5 years old. Then when I was 6 years old, when I was at my dad's house, because my parents were split up from a young age, my dad used to let me go to the horror section, and nothing would scare me. So he picked up the Evil Dead and said, "Here, I was 6 years old. We're going to go home and watch this." And I remember that was the first time that I ever felt palpable fear where my heart started racing. And I know Evil Dead is a much more cartoonish film than something like Don't Look Now, but it gave
Great
me,
film.
yeah, that feeling, that first moment when they're playing cards and guessing, and she turns around and that wicked voice comes up. I don't think I'd ever experienced anything that evil or wicked sounding. Chucky was fun to me. Michael Myers didn't do that, but there's something about it. The minute she falls, they inch forward towards her, and then you see her grabbing the pencil, and I had this really ugly feeling inside of me. She reaches up and stabs and screams. I remember it scared the crap out of me, and it was an exciting feeling. I didn't even tell my dad that the movie was scaring me because I didn't want to turn it off. I was like drawn to it and repulsed by it at the same time. But that was kind of like my first kiss, was seeing Evil Dead at 6 and finally realizing what people were talking about when they said that horror movies got under their skin or horror movies scare them. That was like I felt the power of that. And I'm unable to look at that movie without remembering the first time I saw that scene. It left such a powerful impact on my brain.
Yeah, we re-feel it, right? We
Yeah.
never feel it like we did the first time. The first time's a scare. The rest of them, I think, are thrills because we know what's coming. But we go back there. I think we go back to get that feeling sometimes, hair of the dog that bit you. But
It's like
I think
chasing a
you
high.
mentioned, yeah, exactly. I've been chasing the high for a long time, and it gets harder. But I think it's interesting that you mentioned divorce, right? Because my family was getting divorced at the time of Don't Look Now. And my thing was why I was scared wasn't just that the girl drowned, that the child drowned. It was that the parents weren't there for them.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was kind of what I was thinking in my head the whole time. And I could never say it. I didn't even know how to say it. Who would I say it to? But this movie kind of said it for me in a weird way. And I don't know, maybe you were, hell, my parents, my family life has split completely. How could this giant puppet scare me?
Yeah.
And then you finally found the thing that did, right? And I think we do that a lot. I think a lot of the horror fans that I know are some of the happier people in their second act, right? First act sucked. Whatever happened in your childhood, probably not everybody, but a large majority of the people that I do know that come up to me and are real fans, and I mean real fans like they're involved in it in some way. They're not just spectators. They have to commit to creating something themselves. Most of those folks tend to have had a rough childhood in some way, a rough adulthood in some way, and they broke away from that and they found a way to be happy in this weirdness. And horror tends to be one of those things that really works. But I love that it was Evil Dead, because I saw Evil Dead in high school and it was out in the theaters, and I got lucky. Sometimes these movies that didn't have wide releases would show up in deadwater towns like mine, just to fill out whatever contractual agreement that they had, or it was a cheap enough screen, whatever it was. And they didn't know what to do with Evil Dead because it was not rated. So they just put 2 R's next to the name. It was like, double R. I have to see this movie. It's double R. That's got to be bad. And I was like confused at how insane that movie was when I first saw it. I was like, wow.
Yeah.
My,
Go on, Michael.
I was just gonna say my first kiss was a very different experience too, because I was 27 years old. Before that, no film had ever scared me. I was scared by one film when I was like 15 or 16. I was in church, and some of the deacons and stuff took me into this back room and showed me this film of people getting killed in horrible ways and going to hell. So that was really the only thing that scared me as a kid. So after that, I was excited by fear. I wasn't scared by anything. But then when the Blair Witch Project came out in 1999, I had to be convinced that it was real before I was ever scared by anything. And ever since then, the floodgates have opened, and I'm scared by a bunch of horror films that I watch now.
That's so fantastic. I love Blair Witch. I love how people get so upset about, once again, the perceptions and stuff. And they were like, oh, I thought it was real. And they had this whole thing. That's part of the experience. That's no more of a stunt than Robert De Niro gained 80 pounds to play. I mean, great if you don't tell me. But before he plays Jake LaMotta, you tell me beforehand, and you tell me, oh, Meryl Streep hugged ice when she was dying in Ironweed. And these are all stunts. Everything about film is stunt. So don't try and tell me. It's just the one you didn't like. You fell for it hard. And I love that, because it was such a breath of fresh air. It was so amazing. And it just goes to show how context changes as well, because within 20 years, the found footage thing is so done. But the original, and occasionally there's a great one, but the original Blair Witch has such amazing impact. That's like an experimental film. They had their own cameras, the actors. They didn't know where it was going to go. We're literally feeling this thing. It's mise en scène completely. And I'm like going, this is fucking awesome. And when I saw it, it actually gave me a good scare. They ramped it up just right for that final moment. But I was scared of everything as a kid. Then I went through, I became a horror, heavy metal punk guy, and nothing scared me. And then I became an appreciator, and then I had things scare me again as I got older. But I got scared by radio announcements when I was a kid. The Exorcist was still in the theaters, right? And so they just have Reagan going, yeah, and I'd be in the back of the car going, oh my God, what's that noise? So I didn't even have to see the movie. I'd see a commercial and I'd freak out. I'd see an ugly face. There was a movie, I don't even know if it was a horror movie. It's called Ronald. I think it was called Arnold. It's called Arnold. And it was like a 10 Little Indians comedy. And there was one sequence where in the commercial, there's this painting of a guy, a portrait painting over a fire. And it's the old thing of the eye. There's a hole and his eyes looking through. And the way that they shot it, it looks really grotesque and really scary. And I started getting scared. And the next thing you see is two people making out in the shower, and the shower collapses and you just see the shower head snap. So you're like, oh my God. And they show that eye again. I had nightmares over that. So I was a real scaredy cat.
I can see that. One of the things that I wanted to get to ask you about was your experience watching The Thing in theaters. I found out like a good handful of years ago that The Thing was not a hit when it came out, and it was not beloved. I find that really hard to fathom, because The Thing seems like horror fans love to argue and debate endlessly. I've heard so many horror fans say this sucks, or The Exorcist sucks, or The Shining, or they're going on. I hardly ever hear anybody come after The Thing. It's almost sacrilegious to even say anything negative about The Thing within the horror community. So what do you think it was at the time that caught people so off guard that it was not received well? And just to add to that, a movie that came out 5 years after The Thing, which is Hellraiser, which I think is more disgusting than The Thing. And a lot more wrong on a more psychological level. Why would something like that resonate with audiences and become a hit, where something like The Thing was completely rejected?
Yeah, because John Carpenter died for our sins. That's why. You don't get Hellraiser without The Thing. The Thing really changed everything. But the answer to your question is, look up the reviews of Candyman, the new one. It's the same thing. Literally, the people who are like, oh, I can't stand this hybridization, this politicizing of horror and all of this that they're saying about Candyman, they will talk reverently about The Fly and The Thing. Both transgressive remakes of classics that were of a generation. They were beloved. The Thing wasn't just a good The Thing from Another World was not just a good horror movie. Thing from Another World was like a stamp of approval of the 50s. And now that you can look at it, you can see that it was all about communism, paranoia, all of that stuff, the other, and that the military can figure everything out. Everybody in that movie is professional. Everybody works together except for the scientist, and the monster looks like Frankenstein and a giant carrot. And so, but it's a great horror movie. It really is. But it's a whole different horror film. It has a different mentality. John Carpenter updated a story which would make no sense now. He looked at it and said, you know what? I love The Thing, and I love who goes there, the Campbell book that it was based on. But I'm in a much more cynical world right now, and the people don't really agree. And I'm seeing apocalypse. This is a movie about apocalypse. The Thing from Another World has nothing to do with apocalypse. This has to do with good triumphing over evil, even when it's really scary. And guess what? It might come back. That's the movie that says, look at the skies, watch the skies, right? So that was the whole thing of the 50s. People didn't get it at that time because they were living it. That, oh yeah, what, the movie's about communism? Duh, everything is, right? You know, we're duck and roll underneath desks. There used to be, I don't know if it's still, if you go by a high school or a school, there'll be this little symbol, a nuclear symbol, and it says this is a fallout shelter. Your school was a fallout shelter in case of explosions. There were bomb threats when I was a kid in the 70s. You know, we like to forget these things conveniently and say that it's all happening now. But the thing is that The Thing bothered my dad so much, not just because it was gory, which was a huge thing. That was the thing that broke the back of the audience, because everybody wanted to see, they saw Carpenter beforehand. And if you look at The Fog and you look at Halloween and you look at Escape from New York, these are movies, yeah, amazing films, but they're all pretty tasteful. You know, you have to go to Friday the 13th is the one like throws sand in everybody's face. You know, Friday the 13th is the one that says, oh, you want some, here, we're going to put an axe right in somebody's face. Carpenter didn't do that. He inferred. He was still going on that thing of the politeness of a Hitchcock. And he was like this perfect bridge. He was enough of a new guy thinking of wild terms and camera angles and all this stuff and breaking the rules to get me excited. But he was enough of an old school director trying to, and my dad inherently understood that Carpenter loved Westerns because he made his movies like Westerns. You know, they had the anti-hero, but they're still going to work
Hawks.
with everybody. Yeah, it's all Howard Hawks, right? He was a huge Howard Hawks fan. So my dad and every other dad is thinking, well, we're going to get The Thing. The Thing is supposed to be Carpenter's favorite movie. He even shows it on the TV in Halloween. He's going to do this really respectable Hitchcock, not too scary, but really updated. It's going to make the next generation love The Thing. It's going to have just enough of what I like, but a little bit more action. He's not going to be a bucket mouth. He's not going to have gallons of blood, not like these Chainsaw Massacre movies. You know, they're thinking that. You know, why? Because that's what Carpenter had done up till then. Right? Even Escape from New York. That was the one when my dad started worrying about him. You know, well, I don't know about that end. He broke the tape and, you know, now we're going to have war because this one-eyed bastard is doing this. You know, he was starting to go, I don't know about this guy's politics. And then you have The Thing, and it completely goes anti everything that Hawks was talking about. And I think it had to do that. It's kind of like the new Suspiria. You can't do, what are you going to do? Half colors? No, you have to go brown. You're going to have to go to Berlin. You're going to have to do all of these things that are going to keep it from being the thing that made Suspiria so unique. You have to try and find a new unique. And so I think they kind of painted themselves in a corner because you couldn't do anything that was going to be so Argento obvious, but you still had to get that spirit in there. And I think that's what Carpenter realized. I can't just do that movie. Why do that? And he was like, I can't do it because the world has changed. We don't all work together. We have paranoia. We're not going to survive whatever we've done. And you've got people who are military. They're on a military establishment, smoking pot, wearing earrings in their noses, long hair and beards. My dad's having a shit fit. Right. Okay. So what we're getting there is it does not work with the standards of the time. My dad suddenly realized overnight that he was now outmoded in what was progressive. Okay. And I think that's what's happening to people now. that are my age that are watching Candyman and all this stuff. They're like, wait, I'm the problem? When did I become the problem? And it's this thing they're going, wait, they suddenly value these movies that had very little value except for entertainment, and they always had backstory, they always had subtext, but they're defending like the original Candyman, right? And I love the original Candyman, but even I saw there were some problems with it. I mean, it did sure take its dear sweet time putting that hook into the guy's arm and putting bees in his mouth and stuff like that. I mean, for the other deaths to be so subtle. Candyman's death was really, really explicit in the first movie. And so, I get that you may feel, and I felt it in some movies where I'm like, boy, I feel like I'm not understanding the world anymore. Why is this being done this way? It's because times change. It's because progression continues. Where I stopped being progressive, the rest of the world continued. They didn't have to start at zero back when I was born. They get to start where I got lazy and fat. And so you get all of this stuff that continues to happen. And that's why The Thing was a mess. No movie was that gory. No movie was that crazy. No movie was that brilliant, that ballsy to go in that direction. The critics talk about how every character looked exactly the same. I can't tell who's who. They're all wearing parkas and stuff, all for one scene. Everybody wears a parka, and it's intentional so that you cannot see who is who. But they were looking at it and seeing all the problems. It's like when people talk about the newer films and like, I just don't understand. How could he have a big hole in his hand and nobody's saying nothing? Oh, you have a problem with that, but you could handle every Argento film and the lapsed dream logic that's in those, and talk about how they're great art, and you can't even talk about them in a poor fashion without you seeming as if you don't understand art at all. So, it's a change that happened. And for me and my dad, we watched The Thing. It was a car crash. I wasn't ready for that. I was in shock. I almost fainted when we have the great CPR scene when that head starts to slide down the table. That's the time. It was like 1, 2, 3, and then the head. It was like one extra punch, and I was like, I'm knocked out. Yep, I feel myself tingling, like there's this little. And I was like, that's just the weirdest thing I ever saw, and it's magnificent now. But Carpenter died for our sins. You don't get Hellraiser. You don't have the bar upped until you had that happen. He was literally a pariah. They took him off a Firestarter. They fired him from movies. He had to make Starman as like an apology movie. That, look, I can still make movies that people will like. And so his career, he was on his way. He was like the next, I'm trying to think who might be a good person to talk about. I don't know if he would have made it to like Nolan, but he was a name. His name was above the credits. He was the genre guy. He was getting disgust from critics because they're like, why is horror getting all this stuff? He really had all the classical stuff that could have made him one of the great names. He could have been up there with Spielberg. And then he made The Thing, and that changed everything.
One interesting thing I wanted to just add to that really quick mention, the movie Blade Runner actually opened up on the same day as The Thing. Both
crashed.
Crashed. Both of them were bleak movies, and of course E.T. was killing it at the box office, and America was in this kind of I'd say the throes of Reaganism, like the
2 years in. 2 years in. They didn't know how bad it was going to get, right?
It just seemed like the wrong time for films like that. But now The Thing and Blade Runner are both regarded as like cult films, or not even cult films, just classics, period, I would think.
Yeah, they are. And they're so influential. I mean, you can't see any dystopian science fiction that doesn't echo Blade Runner. You can't see any end of the world horror movie without seeing The Thing. Anything that has anything to do with science and horror is either going to be The Thing or Alien at this point. And both of those are super influential, but they also are the Emperor's New Clothes kids. They mentioned the Emperor had no clothes, and they at the end of that fairy tale, the Emperor had the kid executed. And I think that's what happens. Somebody finally stands up and says, "Listen, this stuff that's going on in 1982. I mean, things like one of the reasons that we have a major homeless issue is that the Reagan administration closed off mental institutions. They closed funding for a lot of buildings. Hospitals closed down, and they literally, these horrible hospitals just drove vans of people into inner city, let them off, and drove away because they had no beds for them. They had nothing for them. And that happened with Vietnam vets. The Veterans Administration got cut. All this interesting stuff happens that we forget, right? And we just go, wow, it just happened. We don't know. It must have been bad life choices. He should have never gotten that second beer. Look now he's out on the street. I mean, it's gotten huge and it's gotten crazy, but it has this start where we ignore the problem. And we're sitting there whistling in the dark, and we're saying how fun Knight Rider is, and the A-Team, and all of that, where all this victory is happening. Rocky 2, Rocky 3, Rocky 4, all this stuff feels really good. We're feeling great about America again, but we're ignoring the problem. And people like Carpenter and people like Ridley Scott, spent their time saying, perhaps there might be something that we can talk about here. Not calling you a monster, but let's talk. And then it's like, you're calling me a monster.
Okay. I'm starting to get things now. Go on, Mike.
Oh,
yeah.
I really appreciate how you analyze films in your book and the personal spin that you put on them. And not only with classic films that are time tested, but also with newer films, newer indie, lesser known films. So my question is, how much do you find yourself analyzing your experience while you're watching a great horror film? And also, do you usually analyze your experience the same if you don't like a horror film?
Oh, dear. Those are great questions. I just did a podcast yesterday with some filmmakers on my show, and I kind of asked the same kind of thing. Like, now that you're making movies, can you ever just let a movie wash over you? Or are you always looking at the camera angles and stuff like that? And what I find is that I usually, if the movie starts poorly, I'm really, my viewing habits have changed a little bit from when I used to pay big bucks to go into the cinema versus streaming on my couch. My impatience comes up quicker, and I start noticing the flaws pretty fast if it starts really, really slow. Like if your horror movie starts with 5 people in a car heading out somewhere, I'm like, oh God. Literally, if you go on Netflix and you just look at coming attractions for horror movies, they all start with a shot of a car and 5 people in them. It's like it's unbelievable. And so if you start with that, I'm already a little bit, but you hit me with something cool, whatever it might be. And there are some movies that have great stingers in the beginning that just got me going. And I will disappear for a while. And I won't be really analyzing. But when I hear something that really hits me, like, wow, that's cool, that's like a bookmark. I go, okay, boom. All right, I'm coming back to this. And there are times when it starts to all come together and I can see what they're trying for. And I go, oh, that's freaking awesome. Or, that's a little on the nose, but most of the time I'm always trying to be scared. I'm always trying to let the movie take me. But when you surprise me, it's kind of funny. Surprise is what I look for. And it makes me go dive deeper. But first I have to hop to the surface. I go, oh, wow, there we go. That's a cool thing. And then I can allow myself to go back down. But when something is out of the ordinary or something goes a little bit further than my expectations, I do recognize it. And I do go, oh, wow. And then it takes me a moment to get back into the movie. Rarely. One of the ones that really did that to me to such a point that I call it a masterpiece now is Martyrs. I was like constantly buffeted by that film in ways that I was just stunned by. And not a bad TV movie. I think it's a great TV movie, but it's a TV movie called Intensity off of a Dean Koontz book. They kind of ripped off the first half hour, 45 minutes of High Tension is that movie. But it's so surprising and so fresh and so arrogant in its way that it's doing what it does, that I was aware that I was watching something that was great and it was tempting me and flirting with me. And at the same time, I was completely immersed to where, like in Intensity, when this woman has to allow herself to be bit by German shepherds to get to a car, I'm like, I'm feeling every second of it. I'm feeling the pow of watching this little woman get knocked over. I was like, wow, this is freaking astonishing. So it's a little bit of all of that. I think I love that. I think the way that I do about movies. If it's bad, though, I count the movies that they're stealing from. I count the ways that I would have done it differently, even though I'm not dig me, I'm not the filmmaker, but at the same point, I'm like, this would have been so much better if they just didn't yell, if they just acted like how people do when they're scared. Just hunker down and be quiet. It would have been so good instead of running and screaming. So stuff like that does happen. And if a movie's bad, I rarely turn them off completely, unless within the first 10 minutes, I'm like, they can't even frame correctly. There's going to be no surprises here. Right?
Okay.
They don't have the ability to surprise me. Right?
So one of the things that I wanted to ask you about, and it's because I'm a fan of this subgenre for trashy purposes. You're not into slasher movies, and I understand why. You also said that they make sex and violence feel safe and boring, which I could kind of get to a second. Is there any slasher movies that you do like, and what would you think of a film like, say, have you seen William Lustig's Maniac from 1980?
Oh yeah, that's a masterpiece. I'm not even sure I can call that a slasher, but I do, because it happened at that time. But I think there's more to that movie. It doesn't really follow the tropes as much. It feels seedier, feels uglier. So, but it is an early slasher, and I do love early slashers because they were, I kind of say it in the book, that they were like punk rock. There was Halloween, which was kind of the bridge between the two things. And then there was Sean Cunningham's Friday the 13th, which just said, I don't know, I think the kids like blood, so we're just going to go nuts. And hey, Savini, can you do this thing with an arrow through the throat? Whatever it was, that was like total transgression. And it was overnight dangerous film again. So instead of it being like I think that ghost stories can be really scary for the first 3/4 of the movie. And once you figure out what the ghost needs to do, then it's just small claims court. It's like, okay, a third party has to come over and these two aren't speaking, so we bring in this third party. And then you put the key wherever it has to go, or the sacred amulet is put down, and you burn the book, whatever it is. So it just becomes a task, right? And it's the same with exorcist films. It's scary when the demon's chasing you, but once you go, oh, I diagnosed this as demonic possession, then it's just bringing the surgeons in, and they're just priests, and they sit there, and the same thing happens. All these scary things that happen in a movie gets to the size of a bed or a chair or a barn. They always have these things people tied down, and so the movie gets that small. And so I kind of zone out unless they come up with something cool. But a slasher film was total surprise because they had no script, right? There was no template yet. Friday the 13th had, the only template they had was Halloween, and Halloween was a third base film. They didn't go all the way. And so he decided, I'm going to do this. And when he did, that was like, wow. So you had all these movies that happened like 80, 81, and a little bit of 1982. All those movies are really pretty good because they're just stealing off of each other. They're throwing anything that they can at the wall. Most of these people are not filmmakers. They're learning to be filmmakers. So they have no clue how far they can push. They don't know anything about a final girl. That didn't exist. And they are just, you watch the first ones, they are ruthless. Anybody can die at any time. The Burnings, it's so funny that you say that. I don't know if I can mention the magazine, but I just did a retrospective on The Burning. So all of this is very fresh for me, for one of the magazines. And I talked about how these movies were punk rock and how The Burning is one of those that works really well because the kids look real. Not all of them. I mean, that bully looks like he's 35, but you have like, oh my God, Jason Alexander and Holly Hunter she looks 12 now. And you had, oh my God, I can't remember his name. He played Woodstock, but he very skinny, gangly, young looking.
The Eddie
Yeah.
character, yeah.
Yeah, the Eddie character is another one. But Woodstock, the guy who gets his fingers cut off. I can't remember the name of
I know who
Fisher
you're
Stevens.
that kid.
Fisher
Mr.
Stevens.
Stevens, yeah.
Yeah. So Fisher Stevens looks really young. And because the actors had no wardrobe, they didn't get really good looking clothes. Like you see, everybody looks like they're out of LL Bean in a lot of the early slashers, or not the early slashers, but the later slashers. They have all the great clothes that you would wear if you were an 80s super kid. But I wore Kmart. I wore Sears. And so because there was no budget for the burning, they brought their own clothes. So they look like camp kids. They had camp kids in that movie. So it has that authenticity, but anybody can die in that movie. And the violence, they saved all their time for one 30-second piece that has 35 shots in it. And it kills 5 main characters. And that's the raft scene. And so that one's great. I think that William Lustig's Maniac is amazing. I think The Prowler is fantastic. I think My Bloody Valentine is fantastic. These are ruthless films. These are ones that are dirtier. They are edgier. They don't have that gloss. They don't laugh at the audience. They're not soup yet. What drives me nuts about people who talk about the slash, they go, well, I like them because they're kind of like comfort food. Well, go watch comfort food. Horror is not meant for that. Horror has a purpose. Horror is not supposed to meet you halfway and give you a sandwich. It's there to freak you out. It's supposed to be unpredictable. That's what it's there for. And so I was destroyed by how predictable they got very quickly, and I got bored by them. I definitely got bored by the Friday the 13th. 1 and 2 were amazing. 3 was weird and fun because it was in 3D. But after that, I really started to see they were playing to the expectations of the audience, not challenging the audience. And the first slashers said, can you take it? And they just hit you with everything. And then after that, it's like, you can take it. Let's make a funny joke. Let's we'll set it all up for the sleeping bag sequence. Everybody talks about the sleeping bag sequence, but nobody talks about the rest of the movie because the rest of the movie is boring. You have a few kills that might be interesting. And that was what bothered me. I don't like being insulted by you taking it easy, right? And or just raking in the cash. And I think that sequels myself, I have a problem with them more than I do remakes. Remakes can really offend you, but they can also take something like The Thing from Another World and make John Carpenter's The Thing, because you can just throw everything away and just have the spine of a really good idea. But sequels constantly tell you more and more, like Nightmare on Elm Street. I didn't need to know anything more about Freddy Krueger than I knew in the first film. But by the end, I know the name of the nursery that he was at and all the nuns that were raped. Blah, 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 blah. And that's the thing. Horror works in the unknown, right? The more we know, the more familiar we are, the more comfortable we are. And I don't think that's what horror is supposed to do. Horror can be fun. Have a horror comedy. They're great. But to take the fangs out of something like Freddy Krueger, who was a child molester, and turn him into a joke factory, kind of offended me. And I thought Nightmare on Elm Street was one of the great ones. But yeah, if anything, Mother's Day. Lloyd Kaufman's brother, Charlie Kaufman, not Charlie, I'm forgetting his name now, but he made one film. It was Mother's Day. Really disturbing, satire on TV and how it affects people and the difference between reality and the fantasy. I'm trying to think of other ones. Happy Birthday to Me is kind of fun. Hell Night's kind of cool. These movies that have this stuff, and some of them are more like they're still kind of living in the giallo world and the mystery world, like Terror Train and stuff like that. They're okay. But I like when they go more towards, I don't know why this guy is doing what he's doing. And if you're in the woods, it's even better because production values are better. Just get out in the woods.
Okay.
I hope that answered the question.
Well, I thought that you just hated slashers. Now I have a much clearer perspective because most of the slashers that I have in my collection on my wall are the ones that you just listed. It's like, okay, we are on the same page for slashers.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, but slashers aren't thought of in that way, right?
Okay.
Slashers, you're picking the good ones. But if you talk to anybody about slashers, I know people who won't watch horror movies that'll watch slashers because they're fun, right? And slashers have become this thing. By the end, they were so denatured. It had nothing to do with those dangerous days. It's like saying that punk rock is Joy Division. and you don't think anything of the Ramones. What's the Ramones? You know, who's the Sex Pistols? No, Joy Division. That's punk. It's like, no, it's a facet of it, but that's towards the end of everything that was going on. Yeah, the stuff that was in the beginning is much more raw, much more close to rock and roll, and kind of like, you know, the thing about rock and roll. In the early days, that was like guys marrying their 12-year-old cousins and you know, all this. That was crazy, right? I mean, that was dangerous music until they got Pat Boone in there to, you know, jazz it up a little bit. But the first rock and roll, that was dangerous. That was smash the walls, make your parents freak out. And I think that's what good horror does, and that's what slasher films did. But by the end, they were thinking of rock and roll as like Donnie and Marie Osmond singing, you know, "Stairway to Heaven." You know, it's not the same.
So in your book, you talk about the communal experience of watching horror in a theater, and then you went into extreme audience response in movies like Blackboard Jungle and The Exorcist.
Yeah.
But why do you think it has happened so few times since then? Like I think Blair Witch was the last one that had, you know, maybe it made everybody cynical because it fooled everyone, and it hasn't seemed to be another communal. Yeah, I was going to say it hasn't seemed to be another communal horror freakout since Paranormal Activity. Why do you think that is?
Paranormal Activity was a great one. I think it does, but it doesn't necessarily happen the way that we think of it. I think the response to Get Out was that people went for it and felt a deep connection to it. And then there were those that were like, it's more of a comedy than it is anything else. I couldn't get into it. It's not a horror movie to me. Oh, you know, I see every horror movie. Have you seen Get Out? I haven't gotten around to that yet. That's a response, right? That's a response. That's a, I don't want to look at that kind of thing, or I need to hear all about that. It may not be fainting. It may not be people coming home scared. But maybe it is. You know, I think the movie Irreversible, when that played, when that played at, I want to say it was Cannes, half of the audience walked out, and I knew exactly when they walked out, right? We all do. Mm-hmm. And there's a movie that's super powerful, and that had walkout potential. That had people like going crazy. We've had movies that, because they're talking about Jesus, people have protested against it. So I think there's still that stuff, but it looks a little bit differently. I'm not sure, though, with what you're talking about. I think that's fucking magic, right? I mean, the chances of it happening are pretty small. And so when it does happen, I think it happens all the time with like the Marvel movies. People go into the Marvel movies like Endgame or the one before Endgame, the one where they snap. Infinity War. Thank you. Losing it. Infinity War. People were talking about that movie like it was The Godfather, right? And when Thanos snaps, everybody goes, oh, and they're having heart attacks. They're having heart attacks watching a movie with superheroes, right? And people are turning into dust, and there's no sound, and people are freaking out. So I think it's not always going to happen with horror films, but I think that movie, because people had to wait for a year, they were like crushed by that movie for a while. The Mandalorian, and I'm assuming maybe you guys saw that, or you're not interested.
I saw the first season.
Okay, so the second season ends with this really revelatory thing that broke the internet, and people took reaction videos of them crying their eyes out because of the end of that. Right? Weeping and going, no, don't do this to me. Don't do this to me. You better, people are out of their comfort. They've allowed the movie or the show to dance with them, right? It's gone to tent revival. It's gone to this thing where it's like, I'm going to allow myself to be thoroughly vulnerable. That's one of the reasons that John Carpenter got pilloried. I'm vulnerable and you slap me. And I think that happens where people just suddenly get vulnerable. I'm trying to think of horror movies where that has happened, but when it's a big thing like Paranormal Activity, it's pretty rare, and I think it's pretty magical. I don't know why some movies just connect the way that they do, and I think sometimes it's thoroughly unconscious. I don't think that Rocky knew, maybe Sylvester Stallone knew that the world needed Rocky, but we didn't. We had no clue until we're watching that movie. And then after that movie, when he knocks down Apollo Creed and everybody's cheering and jumping up and down and crying in the streets, adult men in 1976 crying, it let me know. It let or 1975, it let everybody know that we needed that movie. So I think some things, it's not nearly as much of it's a surprise as it is just this unconscious, subconscious collection of the anxieties that we're feeling right now, or the wish fulfillment. Boy, I wish somebody would just punch that Nazi or whatever it might be. Yeah. And then they do. And it's like, yes, that's it. Voice of a generation. I think that's what Henry Rollins said at one point. He talked about how punk rock was like a bunch of music's happening. Then one guy says, fuck you and fuck everything. And everybody else goes, voice of a generation. And they all follow. Had no idea that he was going to say it before he said it. And he probably didn't either. So, I think that might be some of the thing. I don't know if you can bottle it. I think you just have to thank the horror movie and film gods when we get a movie that just touches us and we forget that it's 24 frames per second or 30 frames per second now.
Yeah, that reminds me, I wanted to mention one more thing about that. You mentioned Rocky, and the way you described that in the book took me right back to the first time watching that and the exhilaration that I felt watching it. So don't you think that the recent movie last couple of years, Whiplash, did that give you the same kind of exhilaration like it did me? That took me back to the first viewing of Rocky.
Oh, wow. That's a great comparison. That's such a psycho movie. I love Whiplash because I consider that a horror movie in disguise.
Really?
Yeah.
Like
really
Dirty
watching,
Harry?
Kind of like Dirty Harry, kind of like 1917.
You actually convinced me a few movies that I never would have considered horror as horror, including Dirty Harry. I was like, a horror movie. And then you explained the perspective and how Clint Eastwood is shot at night versus how he's shot in the day. I was like, oh, that kind of makes sense. I could totally see it. But yeah, you kind of broadened my, because both Mike and I are horror fans, but we're film fans in general. We like all kinds of movies.
Same here. I love them too.
Feel like you kind of broadened my idea of other films that I love that I don't consider horror to kind of bring them into that camp. So I thought that was pretty interesting.
It's a war wound that I have because when I was growing up, I grew up at a time when Andrew Sarris and Pauline Kael were the critics. And then there was Siskel and Ebert. They were kind of like the snotty punk kids. And at that time, cinema, people believed that American cinema after The Godfather and The French Connection and movies like that
great movies,
art could save us. Art could change worlds. Art could make us better. And that we started really reading film. And that's what when I started this, I said, people are reading film again. Sometimes it takes moral outrage and you happen to be right, but you start to read, you start to educate yourself about film to be able to have a good defense. And back in that time, I mean, The Exorcist was up for Best Picture. Jaws was up for Best Picture. And I'm a kid going, I love movies. I love the Academy Awards. This sounds great. I love horror movies. Why? Oh, surely I can put the same critical assessment to a horror film that I can to other movies. And people are like, well, that's just ridiculous. Horror movies are just for bozos. They're for knuckle draggers. What are you doing? And you had the critics who felt self-important around that stuff, and actors who, because they wanted to be taken seriously, they kind of looked down at horror like it was a bad vacation. It was an embarrassment. And yet you can do so much as a character actor in horror films that can make it really interesting. I mean, you're doing things that used to be, I mean, you don't devalue silent films because of the exaggerated acting style that was there. You look at what was done there and how much they were conveying without a word. You can look at a horror film and go, in the world of allegory and metaphor, this is amazing acting. This is working completely to the story itself. And so I grew up kind of a stubborn kid, kind of a Harlan Ellison kid. And I was like, screw you. I'm smart. I like horror movies. I'm not going to be ashamed of either of these things. And guess what? I can talk your horror movies and your movies as much as you want, because I didn't stop with horror movies. I didn't just sit there and watch horror movies. I watched, everything, The Godfather, Apocalypse Now, dear God. I watched movies that maybe 7 people saw because that was just me. I was sucked into cinema. But my heart goes to horror. And probably because I dig the underdog. I'm a punk rock. I'm a heavy metal guy. I'm all that stuff. I dig the underdog. And, that's why I hate gatekeepers. We're underdogs. Stop it. Let everybody in. You don't like that kind of thing. Guess what? Go find yourself a union. Stay away from me.
I wanted to go back to something that Mike was saying earlier. You were talking about how there's not as many experiences that are communal, like like the Blair Witch Project. I was a little kid. I was a different age, but I remember everybody, like you said, thought that movie was real. I kind of got that feeling out of Paranormal Activity, and I got it out of Get Out. I think the reason we might not get it as much as we used to is because I don't think it happens when you are trying to make it happen. And it actually brings me to your podcast, the George Romero one that you did, where you described how Romero kind of revolutionized the genre, but he didn't set out to do that. That was not his intention, was to go out and revolutionize and completely change horror. Something that just happens. It has to be something that I from my perspective, I just think it's like magic. Like you said, it just has to be something that you tap into. Trying to get to that is almost like a guarantee that you're not gonna get there. I would think. And like
I think
a movie like Get Out, I saw that opening day in a largely black audience in Long Beach, and I could hear the appreciation. I got the sense by the laughter, people were laughing at all the right times, gasping, cheering, that this was a horror movie that finally said, look, we're going to speak to your fears, your experiences, and your anxieties. And I thought that was just such a special moment. Really cool seeing Get Out on opening day.
That's awesome. Yeah, I think you're right. Now with that, Jordan Peele wanted to make something that was going to at least speak for people who didn't get the right metaphor. And I had you mentioned Tanana Reeve Du on the Candyman thing, the horror noir, so I had them on my show before horror noir came out. And I was talking to them about Get Out. And I said, it's a very interesting thing. I realized that there was something that I was missing because I didn't have the same experience towards the end. And it was when the character, you see the lights flash, right? The police lights flash and everybody goes, oh, yeah, everybody's heart drops. My heart dropped. And then it ends up being Raj, right? And his friend. And I felt a little disappointed. I was like, oh, it kind of takes the power out of this metaphor they've been working on so hard. They're going to let us off easy. And Tanana Reeve said, honey, we've been seeing black men dying for this metaphor for decades. It was such a great thing to let them live. And it's like, I suddenly got it. It's like, oh yeah, when it was done by Romero,
inversion,
that was a whole different thing, right? At that point, you didn't even have black people in there. So to say that he goes through all of this and dies during the civil rights movement, you have these guys with these dogs chasing after and all this stuff that's hitting right on what the news was. That's powerful shit because they weren't even talking about that. They were ignoring it. They were saying that this was nothing but hoodlums, right? And so that in that context, it makes sense. But we thought that was all the progress we needed to do. Well, just every time you had to kill the black guy. And I mean, not just in the way that black characters always died in horror films, which is the big joke. I mean, you have a main character and he has to go the Jesus Christ way, right? It has to be like the Christ-like death. And it's like, no, that's for me. And that's not for an audience that really needed to see him get away instead of everything, the system always being rigged for him to die, which is what they were reading it as opposed to what I was reading it as. It's just like, oh, well, can't we have this classical end that has this thing? And no, I had to learn. There were things that I learned in Get Out. So to me, that's an intentional thing. But I think you're right about how you can't make this stuff happen. You folks are filmmakers. I firmly believe the best art is at the sense of play. And why I think that horror is so great and healthy and happy for us is that it reinstates the sense of play. We come up with our best ideas through serendipity when we're just kind of standing in a line somewhere and it's really crowded and you see a chainsaw on the wall and you go, I know how I could get out of this room really quick. And all of a sudden a movie starts writing itself, right? But you're already in a sense of play. And so you're not carrying the baggage of responsibility. It's one of the things that I would say. I listened to your Candyman thing. I really appreciated it. I will say, please have the strength of your convictions. Don't let these guys off. You're like, I don't know, maybe they just don't. No, fuck them. Fuck them. They know exactly why they're not liking the movie. You don't have to have a symposium to hold their hands so they can throw their dirty socks on the ground again instead of putting them in the hamper like everybody else. Yeah. Okay. And so that is the kind of thing that I think sometimes weighs down our movies. We lose a sense of play to a sense of moral responsibility. And I'm saying this is a spanking for myself because I should have 200 episodes of the amount of time I've been doing this. But I hand wring and I re-look at my stuff and I question it. I'm like, why did I want to talk about this in the first place? And it can take me weeks to put out a show when I'm doing just an essay style because I lose a sense of play and I start belaboring the stuff and I have to get off of that. And then I do. And then I'm also the guy who says, fine, it's out there. And if you don't like it, you can go fuck yourself really good and hard.
That brings me back to your discussion of like sacrilegious horror experiences that went too far for the audience. Like The Thing went too far for a lot of audience. And then I think recently, Glenn, the Glenn character from The Walking Dead.
Yes.
When he was killed, that really hurt a lot of the audience. And then also with a Serbian film, we're still feeling it from 2010. Yeah. I mean, it had a righteous message about their government, but it just went too far and it hurt a lot of fans. How far do you think is too far with horror?
I don't know. How do I not make this sound like a cop-out? I think you need to have, like I just said, strength of your convictions, right? Mm-hmm. If you want to make a Serbian film, you got to be ready to get your nose bloodied in a restaurant. You need to be ready for someone to come up and just punch you in the face and say, how dare you? Mm-hmm. But you should be able to write it. You should be able to make it. You know, take that. That's what horror is about, the transgression. Now, what do I think? I wish I didn't see a Serbian film. As much as it's a well-made film and stuff, I used to feel so superior in a way, being able to say, I've seen a lot of really nasty movies, but I haven't seen a Serbian film. And then someone kind of on the right day said, you know what, you're kind of hypocritical if you don't watch that thing, at least find out. And I watched it and I said, that's exactly kind of what I thought I was going to feel like at the end. and so it was like, well, great. But I did see it and it angered me a little bit more because it's so well made. It's not like August Underground, right? Something where it's on video and it's so raw that you feel it might be real and it's grotesque, but it still has this energy. Whereas this was very, very well produced. That was like probably all the money Serbia had for one film. They put it all in this one film. And so it's glossy and all this stuff. And then it's like got a rubber baby that they're fucking. And I'm like, really? That's where you went? This is how you decided to do that. And so I felt like it just hit me wrong. But do I think that it shouldn't have been made? No, because I don't know what that means for somebody in Serbia. I don't know what that means for like 5 or 6 people, right? It's not for me. Okay. You know, everybody that hates socialism, I wonder why all movies have to be for everybody. You know, that sounds pretty socialist. You know, it can be something that's somewhat elite. Who cares? It's a preference. So I think that there are some things that my own personal preference shouldn't be. Like, I don't think there's a whole necrophilia thing that I'm not a big fan of in horror films. There are certain things that bother me when I go, that just feels like a cheap shot. But for somebody, maybe it's not. You can put it out there, but you need to be ready. You know, people don't have to like you. And I think that that's one of the things that's hard as artists. You're probably knowing this, which is people will go, well, you wanted to be in this, you should have known better. It's like, no, you know, you can't handle somebody staring at you across at a restaurant. You're like, you want to take a picture? But if you're a movie star, you have to not only be able to have people come up and asking for your autograph all the time, but also people searching through your trash and having that 24/7. That's a whole different experience. That's not contextually the same. You know, even though I said hi, that's all I said. Yeah, but you said hi, we were dressed like a Nazi. You know, that's the problem. You know? And so, you know, it's, I think you have to be prepared, and I don't know if you can be thoroughly prepared for some of it. There are movies like Cannibal Holocaust where they thought it would be really funny hiding the audience or the actors from the audience, and then somebody said, "I think he actually killed these people," and Deodato was in front of a court, and he had to have the actors come out of hiding. You know, he wasn't expecting that. He didn't think he was this far away from going to jail because they wanted to put him away because they hated the movie. You know, this stuff you need to be protected on. But I think turnabout's fair play. You know, people have the right to be upset about your movie, but I think you have the right to make it. And I know that sounds like a cop-out, but I don't know a better answer, because every time that I think about how I wouldn't want a movie made about certain things, I think about how subjective horror is. What scares you may not scare me. What scares me might put you in a coma. I have no idea. But there are different versions of horror for everybody. There's a different style for everyone. There are ghost stories for those that don't like gore. There are gore movies for those that do. There are movies that are funny because people get nervous laughter if they get scared, and that helps them. There are musicals that are horror movies. I mean, all these things, there's a horror movie style for everyone, because horror is kind of a human need. It does this thing that I think is a sense of play, but it also allows us to touch on that shadow self and allow us to let go of some of this pent up venal anger that being an animal in the 21st century does. You know, and the price of meat keeps going up. I'm going to get mad. I better watch a horror movie.
You know, you said something right now that kind of resonated with me. You're talking about a Serbian film and your personal reaction to it, and how you also have to look at it how somebody in Serbia might perceive the film, how they might have a perspective on it that you don't. All right, I'll admit, one movie, a horror movie that I don't like, is one that you mentioned earlier that you like a lot. And me and Michael actually got in an argument over this movie, is Martyrs. I actually kind of hated that movie. It's one of the few horror movies that actually actively pissed me off while I was watching it, and I felt irritated when it was done. And me and Mike got into it over it. However, I read this. She's a film critic I know. Her name is Michelle Kisner. She's a black female film critic from Michigan, and she brings a very unique perspective to like exploitation and horror movies. And her review was a glowing review. I thought the opposite of the movie. She thought of it as a very feminist film about the way that women are portrayed on screen, the way that suffering is put out for women. And I still am personally not a fan of that movie, but that review kind of tipped the way that I think about it a little bit from a different perspective. Maybe it's not a perspective that I can personally appreciate, maybe because the movie just angered me, but I understood from her point of view why to her it's an important film with a feminist message. So
yeah,
kind of
the important line in Martyrs for me is, women make the best martyrs, said by a woman who's in control of a group of people, and that they are literally fetishizing suffering instead of seeing real women for all of their problems. They I not to get anybody angry about religion, but I think that movie says a lot about how religions treat women and how they can put the Virgin Mary on a pedestal as long as there's enough suffering, not giving anybody freedoms, but making suffering sacred. And that's what I think that movie talks about a lot. In fact, the beating of the woman every day takes on this level of kindness, but it's also like the Stations of the Cross for Christ, right? You have this whole thing where it becomes a ritual, beating her, and she becomes accepting of it. And there's almost a weird kindness coming from the executor who's doing that. It's an astonishing film to me about how we really look at women. And I love that the end of it, she whispers something in this woman's ear, and she says, keep doubting, and she shoots herself in the mouth. This whole idea that you could build an entire empire on a false belief, and then what do you do? And so I thought that movie definitely talked about how lip service is given to so many minorities. In this movie, it's women, but that they get groups and power structures give lip service and tell you, you're living the good life down there in West Virginia. You're good, honest, hardworking people, but we're not going to help you at all. You know, and you know what? You suffered so much in the cotton fields and in the civil rights movement. We're not going to help you, but we will fetishize the violence. You know, we show pictures of people. We're only during the civil rights march. We're not going to show everybody walking across the bridge. We're going to show dogs biting you. You know, all of that stuff. We fetishize the suffering because then we make people who have nothing. Their suffering is the value. That's currency, and that's how they keep you down. So that's why I love Martyrs. What the name is Martyrs, not in search of martyrs. It's not making martyrs. It's martyrs. You know, who's the martyr, right? And so I love that movie just completely surprised me by having that kind of strange, bizarre depth, and was gory as hell, and was as crazy as hell. So I love that you didn't like it. I'm cool with that.
Yeah.
But I love talking about it as well, because I talk about this at conventions. If I talk to a horror fan, I usually talk to them for about 20 minutes. If I talk to a non-horror fan, someone who doesn't like them, I talk about 20 minutes because there is a passion that comes out of it. And I go towards passion. And I know there was something else that you had mentioned that I wanted to bring up, but I forget. I know you mentioned sex and violence versus nudity and violence. I thought it very interesting that you thought that Hellraiser was super disturbing and gross, because that's a movie that actually does sex and violence. I'll never understand why we continue to have, like, why I call it nudity and violence. It's the simplest, safest stuff. We have all the gore in the world. We'll take a person's body apart where we'll have tongues flying in the air and eyeballs poking out. But we have to have just a little bit of TNA. Don't really show the sex. Make sure it's almost missionary position. Make sure it's cis male. And it's good and safe and won't offend anyone. Yet, what are we trying to do? We're trying to get to the most anxious, vulnerable parts of us. What could be scarier than a horror movie about sex? Now, and that's what you look at with, S&M. Well, just the idea of the forbidden, and where it can take you. And that's what I think Hellraiser did such a, Books of Blood, masterpiece. I talk about that. I just reread it again. Fucking amazing.
I'm gonna tell you something. I used to read a lot when I was younger, and I kind of stopped in the past 5 or 6 years. This was always my favorite collection of horror stories. I'm a big Clive Barker fan. Your book inspired me to go back and buy another copy of this, and now I'm deep into. I've read it before, but such an amazing book. So thank you for reigniting my passion for horror literature too, not just film.
I'm so happy to hear that. That makes me so happy, because Books of the Quiet Revolution, that was the first one, right? I couldn't get into horror movies. My dad was going to take me to The Exorcist. He wasn't even going to take me to Jaws. He's like, are you kidding me? You can't watch fish without freaking out. And so, where was I going to go? I found it in books, and I was safe because of the library card, and my dad was functionally illiterate. So he thought books were hard work. He thought they were homework, right? And then I got Jaws, and there's this really, really nasty sex scene between Brody's wife and Hooper. And that's not in the movie, right? They have a big affair. And I'm like, what? This is awesome. Books are fantastic. And so I love when people go back to books. And Books of Blood is amazing. That was so, I have to respect Stephen King. Yeah, I have to respect Stephen King, because Stephen King has really looks at horror and society as like a disturbed Norman Rockwell. He loves to go at the normalness and that provincial stuff of New England, but he is still a pretty polite New England guy. He goes towards the horror. There's the occasional nasty sex thing that might happen in the books, but he's safe in that way. He's that violence guy. We're going to get horror and supernatural.
There's a moral clarity to what Stephen King does. There's always an easy identifiable hero, a villain, and except for maybe something like Pet Sematary, it's always good triumphs over evil. Books of Blood has no moral clarity to it, and it doesn't seem even interested. And I think that aspect unsettles me. There's nothing safe about what Clive Barker is doing. He's not interested in morality or heroes or who's right and wrong. Just putting you into, and his descriptions go beyond anything I think Stephen King would ever describe. And the sex and the violence, it's all gets under my skin.
That's why I have to give King respect, because King promoted Barker. He could have been like, ugh, God, what's this kid doing? Obviously, he wants to put queer stuff in here. That's not my thing. He didn't do that. He sat there and said, here is a vibrant new voice. You should be reading Clive Barker. He saw the light, and he was cool enough to be able to allow that. But that's the thing. Barker changed a lot of people's lives. He allowed us to see ourselves in ways that we didn't see ourselves before. People were hiding a lot of themselves, and there was this ability to even talk about this stuff, which, I mean, like in heavy metal, until Rob Halford comes out as gay, unspoken that it was, we don't go there. And that's a dominance that didn't have to happen, right? But it did. And I think the same thing happened in horror. And then you have Clive Barker, who says, let's just talk transgressively about everything. And that book is really openly queer in many different ways. And it is also, yeah, and there is a lot of fascinating stuff that isn't, but is just really strange and bizarre. And he allows sexuality. I mean, that's where we're at our most vulnerable. If you look at what the big scares that people have right now is about gender fluidity and gender talks and, what is happening to moral values. And so it's always about sex. It's about body reproductive rights, all that stuff. That's where we're vulnerable. And yet horror often just goes, here, take a look at some boobies. Yeah, she's got nice boobs. Oh, I bet you want to have sex with her, don't you? Well, sorry, we're going to put an axe to her head. And that's a waste of an opportunity. But the thing is, you end up really upsetting a lot of people. And it amazes me how well Hellraiser did. And it didn't do great when it came out, but it became popular. And I think we allowed our freak flag to fly a little bit. I think there's something about BDSM that allows people to, I don't have to be in it, but I can understand it. It's curious and it's interesting and it's exciting. So I can hang with that. And I have some leather, so I can wear leather, whatever it is, you're allowed something there that you may not see in other places of vulnerability. And I think it was a brilliant stroke. I talk about it, I think, in the book, where I'm in San Francisco. So I talk to some people who run dungeons or have run dungeons in the area. And it's like overnight, it went from like Victorian black and reds and, this whole thing of people wearing vests to chains and hooks and blood on the walls. And that was the thing of Hellraiser, just changed attitudes and opened stuff up to allow safe danger again. And I think that's the thing. Horror always allows us some danger, but it also does so in a way that we can't get too hurt. Horror will never hurt you. Horror movies will never hurt you. The world has really heavy shit in it. And we can talk about that really heavy stuff without it feeling heavy, because we know it can't hurt us, and it changes our fears into thrills. And I think that's where it can be really, really cool.
Yeah.
There was a chapter in your book that really connected with me, the chapter on music. Because I used to be a singer in a metal band, and I was a singer in a metal band for the same reasons why I was a horror fan. So you mentioned that your church elders gave you a list of bands that were forbidden, and you would discover bands that way. Yeah. So why do you think religious groups never realize that they're only promoting what they're protesting and making it more titillating, therefore more popular?
Yeah, well, I think some don't care. But I think you need the light to create a shadow, right? You need the devil to be able to make God super powerful, right? You need the bad guy. So you have to promote the bad guy to be able to make it be something. But I think for like my group, that's a cult. So they just assume I think like everybody else, which means I'm going to be horrified that the Pina Colada song, if you play it backwards, says marijuana. And it's like, oh, so, shit like that was what I was growing up with. Electric Funeral. They have a song called Electric Funeral. And everybody's like, oh, and I'm like, Electric Funeral sounds fucking awesome. I'd love to see an electric funeral. But, they're assuming that you don't really go outside of the village. It's M. Night Shyamalan's The Village. Everybody lives there. Everybody's the same. Anybody who says, well, what's over there behind the corn? It's like, you don't go behind the corn. You want to die? Yeah, that's what happens if you go behind the corn. So they're just preaching to the converted. They're not going out. They didn't go to, when they're trying to find people at airports and stuff, they're giving them things like, would you like to be happy for the rest of your life? Oh, sure. I'd love to be happy for the rest of my life. And they give them a tract and then you follow them. They don't go, hi, how are you? Would you like to know how Satan's in 45 of the 50 songs you just listened to? No, they give you that once you're in, right?
Yeah.
But I love that you were in a metal band. And that was, I think there's a wonderful Venn diagram somewhere. Like my weirdness, there's a Venn diagram of all the circles where they all just kind of overlap around me. But there's metal and there's weird music and there's plays and there's Sam Peckinpah movies and there's
Sam
punk
Peckinpah.
music. And yeah, so we find that we all go towards a darkness, right? We go towards a gritty reality. There are certain movies that I can name, and I know people, The Deer Hunter. If I mention The Deer Hunter, 50% of the people who, they've watched it. People who aren't horror fans, they probably forget about The Deer Hunter unless they were vets or something. They'll remember Apocalypse Now. But there are certain movies, Clockwork Orange, I can mention. Oh man, everybody's, these are things that we find the Venn diagram where it's overlapped from the regular world or the transgressive world or the indie world, and it falls into horror. And horror never throws anything away. It grabs it all and uses it and synthesizes it. And fans like us tend to like. I like hard, heavy metal and guitars. I like punk rock music. I like, certain levels of kink. I like horror books, and I like comedy that's a little bit dark, like Bill Hicks. I'm going to find myself going towards these things where it might be a surprise if I was to say, I really like the comic stylings of Henny Youngman. People would be like, that's a little out there. I wouldn't have expected that from you. But there's a certain mindset. I think it's a questioning mindset. I think it's an outlier mindset. I think it's the underdog mindset. That's why Peckinpah's movies are so great. He was a drunk, and he has all the drunk's mentality. Brave at one moment, cowardly the next. And he shows that in his characters. His characters are super layered.
Straw Dogs.
Straw Dogs. Wow, that's crazy stuff right there. How he got away with that, I'll never know. And how, I think it's amazing. But it's a strong cup of coffee. Let's put it that way. So yeah, I love that. I love that. My church never realized. They just assumed I was going to be a good preacher boy. And instead, I discovered Black Sabbath, and the Bloody Sabbath post album cover. I stared at that one for a long time. And all of those bands early on. And that was another thing. Metal early, couldn't touch it. It was like, that was danger music. And then it got a little soft. But
yeah, there's a fascinating trilogy of documentaries called Paradise Lost. It was on HBO.
Yes, yeah.
It's about those three boys in West Memphis, Arkansas, that they were accused of murder and put on death row just because they listened to metal and dressed all black.
Yeah, because they were the other, and they probably were lippy, right? They didn't cower like they should have cowered. And they were always suspect for stuff. I was that, I was the good preacher boy. And then when I fell off the wagon, I was Metal, Spikes and Chains, listening to Man of War, all that stuff. And so I'm walking around town. My dad used to be a police officer. And when I was heading towards 18, I was getting into a lot of trouble, and good trouble, but they were watching for people who dressed like me. And I remember people going, I hear your birthday's July 19th. Police officers would say stuff like that. That's the big one, right? Yeah, we'll be watching. Just to give me a little bit of threat, just to push me, let me know that they're killing me with kindness. They really want to hurt. They want to help. They don't want to hurt the sinner. They just want to hurt the sin. Strangely enough, the sin is inside of the sinner. If there was a way to unscrew and take it out, that'd be great. But it seems like all the pain goes on the sinner, but not the sin.
So I just wanted to ask you this question, and this is more just curious. You were talking earlier about the silent horror films. Have you ever seen A Page of Madness from 1926? It's a Japanese horror film. It's deeply surrealist. You could find it. It's
Yum.
71 minutes long. Do you like David Lynch, right?
Yeah.
Obviously, yeah. You talked about Mulholland Drive. This movie, I just felt like I should recommend this to you if you haven't seen it, because I feel like not enough people have seen it.
Yeah.
It's from 1926. It's about a mental asylum and a husband going to an insane asylum because his wife is locked away in there, and then he slowly goes mad himself. And it's so modern and so deeply surreal that it seems like it kind of leapfrogged over film history to get at to something that it took decades for most filmmakers to get at. So if you haven't seen A Page of Madness, 1926, I wanted to recommend to you.
Yes, A Page of Madness. Don't mind me while I write this down. You've seen Night of the Hunter, right?
Oh, I love Night of the Hunter.
Yes.
Yeah.
Mike and I actually a discussion about that when we did a podcast on 100 years of horror, and Mike named that his favorite horror film of the 1950s.
Nice. See, I think David Lynch watched that movie, and that's
Okay.
where he got a lot of his stuff, because that movie has a weird, surrealistic look at nature and the way that the kids are, and the strange heads popping up with the "Hello, children, let me tell you the story," and the
Yeah.
way that the monster, right hand, left hand, how he's acting, and he's so arch. And towards the end, where she shoots him with the shotgun, he gets up and goes. Is such a Lynchian moment. And so I think that Lynch does, that movie does, is it successfully remembers to look at the world through the eyes of a child. So Lynch's movies tend to have child logic, child fear. If you look at Blue Velvet, sex is so weird and foreign and strange, and bad guys are like going like this, like nobody does that, but they're walking around. I'm Paul, and so I think that the secret to Lynch is that he looks at things, adult situations, through a child's eyes, and it just looks strangely weird, barbaric, sexual, and violent all the time. And I think it's I see that in Night of the Hunter, that there's just this really fairy tale kind of weirdness, a story where children are truly at risk, and it feels like it's told by a child. It's really cool.
Well, we've kept you for about an hour and a half now, but there's one more question I had to talk to you about. You talked about fiction mimicking reality in one of the chapters in your book, and you talked about a scene from the TV series Mr. Robot in particular. That's a big favorite of James and I both. Mm-hmm. So I found it interesting that you would talk about this show in the context of horror, because don't you think a lot of scenes in Mr. Robot elicit similar feelings to that of a horror film?
Oh, yes, I absolutely. I think there's no surprise, once again, that all three of us are huge Mr. Robot fans. And the people that I know that are Mr. Robot fans are pretty heavy-duty ones. And other people are like, I never even heard of that thing. What, Mr. Robot? USA Network? Isn't that like a tacky? So we find it, right? We find that thing. And of course, I think that show is definitely horror, because, I mean, what's trying to make you feel? There's the idea of intense feelings of dread, terror, disgust. All of those things are in that, and it's trying to elicit that. And then you have to ask yourself, why? Why, out of all the different things that you could do, all the different stylings of film, did the director choose that lighting, that pacing, that storyline, the feel that show has, the music that show has? And the same with Breaking Bad. This is another show that's a horror movie. It's a long form horror film. You're watching the descent of a demonic possession of money and pain and anger. And so I think both of those are horror films, because what do they want you to go home with? What feeling do you want to go home with? Bambi scared people, but it made you feel good at the end about being alive and being a happy deer. But you watch Mr. Robot, what are you supposed to feel, right? I did this thing. This thing saved people. I destroyed the world, and now they want to make me do it again. And I mean, all this stuff is the work that's Caligari stuff over and over again.
Yeah, definitely could see that. And I wish we could keep you for like 2 more hours, but I know you got the things to do. It's actually been a really fascinating conversation with you. I was really looking forward to this. So for the listeners out there, please check out his book, Screaming for Pleasure: How Horror Makes You Happy and Healthy. Like I said, it's beautifully done. And I think if you're not a horror fan, reading this book will give you a good idea of what people get out of horror and the feeling that it gives them, and why it makes people happy, and why you might find, at least in my opinion, metalheads, horror fans, people who are into weird stuff tend to be friendlier and happier, in my experience anyway, than people who are not. So I think it's worth checking out. It reignited my passion for horror literature, which is why I'm reading Clive Barker again. Made me want to revisit a lot of the films that you were talking about and the way that you discussed them. And I have to go back and rewatch Don't Look Now because of the vivid description that you gave of the feeling it gave you in that scene and everything. Excellent book. If you're really into horror, please check it out. If you're not into horror, it'll give you a good insight into what we love about it.
It's very kind. Thank you so much for having me here. This is great fun. I hope I didn't get too weird.
Oh,
When I
no.
start
Oh,
talking
not at all.
this is my
Not at all.
passion, and I get crazy.
Thank you so much.
James and I eat this stuff up. I know he and I were both fascinated the whole time, fascinated and inspired as both a horror fan and a horror filmmaker. And I think every fan and filmmaker and storyteller should go get this book.
Oh,
They will
that's
definitely
wonderful.
relate to it.
Thanks for the very, very kind words. It's one of my favorite things to hear you say that as a filmmaker. It makes you think more, because I've been doing a few lectures at some colleges that I've been asked by the professors who read the book, and nothing makes me more excited. Like, will you do it? We can't really pay you much, but could you do it? And I'm like, you want to give me 2 hours with young, impressionable minds that want to create the art of the next generation? Sign me up. Not a problem.
Yes.
Yeah. And it's like, wow, it's such an amazing thing to be given that opportunity to just even speak this stuff. And this is what saved my life, was getting back into wanting to talk about this passion and just starting conversations.
Yeah. Well, thank you
Very
so
cool.
much for giving us your time. Wonderful conversation. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the great conversation.
That was horror author S.A. Bradley. Check out the book. It's totally worth reading, especially if you want to understand horror. Keep up with us. Pickles Horror Show. Facebook.com/Pickles Horror Show. That's our Facebook. If you want to see our TikTok greatest hits, go to @Horror Show Official. That's our TikTok. As far as Instagram goes, you could check it out right now. At some point, Mike and I are going to revamp it and put up a new one. But if you want to check out the one that's existing at the moment, it's @Pickles Horror Show.
Don't forget to play along with the October Horror Subgenre Challenge that we do every year. This is our 7th year doing it.
Yes.
And we're going to make it even more challenging this year. James is going to do the challenge on TikTok, and then I'm going to do the challenge on Facebook. So check out both of our choices throughout the month, and choose your own and tell us what your choices are.
And of course, we have a horror script that we just wrote. We're not going to give too much details about it, but keep on the lookout for it. We're in the middle of a lot of negotiations.
We will tell you that the movie is going to be really violent and gory
And
and
inclusive.
dramatic.
And inclusive. So for you sensitive horror fans, bye-bye. Sorry. Get over it. Till next week, folks. Happy horror.
Happy horror.